APUS history, folks. This is the first of what we're going to call In Case You Missed It. Basically an overview of the study guide, running right down the questions, attempting to get you information that perhaps you missed while you were in class, or maybe you weren't there that day. You missed it in some way or another, just making sure that all the information is in place. We're about a week out from the test. Format for these, I'm going to try and make these less than 10 minutes, and I'm going to try and run through each of the decades that we've studied. So there'll be a 1760s one, a 70s, 80s, and 90s as well. I'm not going to stop if I make a mistake. I'll be honest with you, some of the other ones, when I do them, I'll make a mistake, and I'll stop and say, ooh, that was awful. I'm not going to do that here. So if I get to rambling or if the answers aren't exactly what you're hoping for, I apologize. Hit me up with an email or tweet me or something like that, and I can respond to you. I can retweet, and we can have a message going back and forth. I'm sitting at my kitchen table, by the way. Normally I do these while I'm standing in the guest bedroom, but I'm sitting at my kitchen table because, frankly, I don't want to stand up for that long. I stand up a lot during the day. So here we go. I have my study guide in front of me, and hopefully you do too. There it is, ladies and gentlemen. There's the study guide. If you don't have one, I don't know what you've been doing for a month. Sorry. Here we go. We're going to start with the top of it. The question asks us, how did the French and Indian War change British policies toward the American colonies? Quite frankly, the English spent so much money on the French and Indian War that they now needed to recoup that money. They discovered that the American colonies only made a fraction of the money that they were supposed to make, and so now they're going to try and make money off of the Americans. Gradually speaking, those taxes are going to be increased to the point where Americans resented them. Now, earlier on in the war, Americans also resented the way they were treated by the British. They felt as though they'd gotten rough treatment at the hands of British officers who didn't understand that a colonial militia wasn't professional soldiers. They had shown up of their own volition, and many of them wanted to go home and weren't allowed to go home. And that didn't seem fair to them. So overall, the English are going to try and hit the Americans for more taxes. They're also going to limit their expansion into the west over the Appalachian Mountains by the proclamation of 1763, and that's going to anger the American colonists even more, especially those who had fought the war, hoping for the opportunity to expand into those lush territories of the Ohio River Valley. Yeah, they're playing a baseball game there tonight, actually. Three River Stadium, Pittsburgh. Actually, I think it's like PNC Park now. Ask Sanders, he'll know. Going down the list here, it talks about the Sugar Acts. Now, the Sugar Acts really weren't about the tax themselves, but the enforcement of them. Remember that the Sugar Act lowered the tax on sugar from 6 pence per gallon to 3 pence per gallon in 1764. Now, that really wasn't that big of a deal. What was the big deal is that the English actually intended to enforce this act. Right underneath this term, we see Vice Admiralty courts. The Vice Admiralty courts were going to be used in order to prosecute smugglers. And smuggling was a way of life in the American colonies. Plenty of the American founding fathers made their fair share of coin off of smuggling. So the resentment of the Sugar Act isn't necessarily so much aimed at the fact that it was 3 pence per gallon. It was the fact that it was more than 0 pence per gallon, because if you smuggled, you didn't pay the taxes anyway. And now the British, after a long period of salutary neglect and not really enforcing these economic sanctions and the laws of the mercantilist system, are going to try and enforce them on the Americans, and the Americans are going to begrudge that. The real fireworks, though, we save for the Stamp Act, and that's the next thing on our list as we head down. In 1765, the British announced that they would begin taxing American colonists for a Stamp Act. Now, the stamp was to go on all printed materials, really anything you can think of, playing cards, books, periodicals, business deeds, certificates, anything that you can imagine that was paper had to have one of the stamps on them. The English had paid one of these taxes for a long time. Remember that the English living in England paid about 5 times more taxes per capita than the American colonists did. And the stamp tax was one of those. They paid it for generations, and it was a pretty good moneymaker. The English thought that things would go well in the American colonies, but unfortunately, the Americans didn't go for it. Now, we saw a variety of different types of resistance from my American colonists here. Number one, we're going to see the Stamp Act resolves, which are started by Patrick Henry, who's a young, fiery legislator in the Virginia House of Burgesses. Patrick Henry's not going to come right on the edge of saying that we should leave England, and that we should declare independence today, but he certainly is going to hint that America should be able to govern itself, and if we're going to be taxed, then those taxes should be created by individuals who are elected by Americans, not people who happen to come from Parliament. That's the real civilized response. It leads to a Stamp Act Congress where 9 states sent delegates to New York to discuss their similar issues. The less civilized response is the one that's probably the more remembered ones. The pelting of people with paving stones, the riots, the acts throughout the colonies that remind us that once in a while, popular violence does actually do some good. Okay? The Sons of Liberty are very active in going out and dissuading stamp agents from ever doing their job. And by doing so, they force the English into a very, very poor position. The English respond by revoking the Stamp Act in 1766. At the same time, they lower the Sugar Act. Again, that really doesn't matter to the colonists because it's not about the fact that it's 1 pence per gallon now. It's about the fact that you actually want to tax us and enforce us. Not fair. At the same breath that the British revoke the Stamp Act and peel back most of the Sugar Act, they also issue a really puzzling document called the Declaratory Act. And the Declaratory Act declares that the British can, at any point, rule over us in all matters absolutely. It in essence said that the Americans had no right to govern themselves. At the heart of this issue is this idea of virtual and actual representation. We as Americans believe we deserved actual representation in the same way that Kevin McCarthy actually represents us in Congress. He's our elected fellow and a wonderful one at that. But the British believed that every member of Parliament represented every British soul throughout the entire empire, whether they were in the American colonies, or if they were in Australia or Africa or a mile from Parliament in London. They were all represented by every single parliamentarian, and by that notion, then they were represented. Whether it was virtual or not, you got representation. The Americans believed that that was not fair. They wanted to be taxed only by people that they had elected. More and more, we're going to hear the American cry for an actual representation. Moving down my study guide, I see that we come across things like some of the ideological inspirations of the American resistance. A lot of this comes from training as lawyers, which many of the Patriots and Sons of Liberty had, Enlightenment documents, especially those written by Montesquieu and John Locke, and individuals who were instrumental in shaping the ideas of European thought a generation before. We can't also throw away English common law, going back to the Magna Carta, which granted individuals liberties and rights that could not be rescinded by the king. Now, in 1767, this all bubbled up again when the English issued what was called the Townshend Act. The Townshend Act taxed building block items in the American colonies: paint, glass, lead, tea, and paper. All of these were things that American colonists needed on a daily basis because they were a growing set of colonies, and the English believed that they really had the Americans here. They would have to buy these goods and therefore have to pay these taxes. What really angered Americans was that they were going to take the revenues from these taxes and pay the salaries of colonial governors as well as pay for the troops in the Americas. We believed that this was a particularly pernicious act in the sense that it went around the colonial assembly's right to pay those salaries. Now, colonial assemblies often did not pay those salaries because they wanted to make sure that governors acted appropriately. Okay? Now, when I turn over the page here, I see briefly discuss the roles played by women in the resistance movement. You have to know the phrase homespun textiles. Homespun textiles. That's the key phrase here. The women spun their own textiles as a way of making sure that when non-importation movements or boycott movements took place, Americans had all of the resources and the supplies that they need, and they didn't have to buy British goods. It became almost a sign of chic that you were wearing your homespun textiles. Very trendy, very trendy. Okay? As we go down, we finally get ourselves toward the Boston Massacre. That's in 1770, so that's going to be in the next installment. But if I had to say one thing that you really need to remember from this portion here, take this. The English fought the French and Indian War. They paid for the French and Indian War, and they believed that the Americans benefited from it as much as they did, and Americans should have to pay for it. We were coming off of that period of salutary neglect, where we believed that we had been given more and more responsibility and more of a free rein to rule ourselves, and suddenly we were being told that we were not going to have that opportunity anymore. We got upset about it, and you can see that in political as well as popular backlash. Americans simply put up a fight, and it went away. We can see that when the Stamp Act is repealed. We can see it when the Sugar Act is lowered. We see it when the Townshend Act is eventually repealed as well, all except for the tax on tea. I'll see you in the second installment. I hope you're enjoying this. Study hard, folks. This can be done.